Did you know students in the Middle Ages had actual games? Not just dusty scrolls and stern lectures. Were these games anything like what you play today, or were they completely different? What if the Dark Ages were actually brimming with surprising forms of learning even for students from the 5th to the 15th centuries? Number 8. The Scholar's Labyrinth. Imagine a large, often intricately painted board, sometimes even a physical pathway laid out with stones or colored cloths, stretching across the floor of a monastic scriptorium or a university hall. This was the Scholar's Labyrinth, a game of intricate design and demanding mental agility, popular among students of logic and rhetoric from the 11th century onward, particularly in the nascent universities of Paris and Bologna. The game involved a series of interconnected pathways, each marked with a different concept, a philosophical question, or a Latin maxim. Players, often working in pairs or small groups, would navigate this labyrinth, not with their bodies but with their minds, following a specific logical sequence or argument. The goal was to reach the truth at the center, or perhaps a solution to a complex theological dilemma, by correctly answering questions or choosing the path that represented the most sound reasoning. Each step in the labyrinth required a player to state a premise, draw a conclusion, or identify a fallacy in a presented argument. For instance, a path might branch, one leading to argumentum ad hominem and another to modus ponens. Player would have to explain why one path was correct and the other flawed, based on the rules of formal logic. A simple error in reasoning meant a step back, or a penalty requiring the player to recite a lengthy passage from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, or Aristotle's Organon. The game masters, often senior students or even professors, would oversee the proceedings, acting as arbiters of logic and truth, their judgments final. The Scholar's Labyrinth was not merely about rote memorization. It was a dynamic exercise in applying logical principles. Students learned to identify logical fallacies, construct valid syllogisms, and dissect complex philosophical arguments under pressure. It was a simulation of the rigorous disputations that were central to medieval university education. A manuscript from the University of Paris, dated approximately 1250, describes Labyrinthus Scholasticus as a necessary preliminary exercise for students preparing for public debates, sharpening their wits and preparing them for the intellectual duels of academic life. Master Peter Abelard, though he lived before the game's widespread adoption in its board form, would have certainly appreciated its spirit, as his own dialectical methods greatly influenced the kind of critical thinking this game demanded. Students would often draw their own miniature labyrinths on wax tablets, mapping out potential arguments and counter-arguments before formal sessions. This practice, documented in the margin notes of a 13th century student's textbook now held in the Bodleian Library, highlights the personal and portable nature of these intellectual exercises. The game fostered not only individual reasoning skills but also a collaborative spirit, as students often had to justify their choices to their peers, leading to lively discussions and deeper understanding of logical principles. It was a common sight to see groups of students huddled around these boards in monastic cloisters or university courtyards, engaged in intense yet playful intellectual battles. Number 7. The Alchemist's Scales. Forget bubbling cauldrons and secret formulas for turning lead into gold. The Alchemist's Scales was a sophisticated game of measurement, proportion, and calculation, crucial for students learning basic mathematics, geometry, and the properties of materials in the 12th to 14th centuries. Often played in workshops or the private studies of well-to-do merchants and scholars. The game involved a set of exquisitely crafted balance scales, a collection of precisely weighed tokens representing different elements or ingredients, like earth heavy stones, water, small shiny brass tokens, along with a variety of containers and measuring spoons. The objective was to achieve a specific weight or proportion, using only a limited set of tools and elements, or to determine the unknown weight of a hidden item placed on one side of the scale using the known weights. One common challenge involved balancing a specific target weight, say, 5 parts of earth and 3 parts of water. Using only a selection of provided tokens, players had to mentally calculate, and then, physically, apply the correct combinations of weights to achieve perfect equilibrium. Another scenario might present a scenario where an impure substance needed to be purified by removing a calculated amount of a specific element, requiring precise subtraction and division. The game masters, usually tutors or experienced apprentices, would often introduce irregularities, such as an unbalanced scale forcing the students to first calibrate their tools before attempting the task. The challenge was not just mathematical, but also practical, requiring a steady hand and keen observation. Complexity grew with the introduction of recipes or formulas that required specific ratios, such as a solution requiring gold in a ratio of 1:7 with silver. Students would have to use their tokens to represent these ratios accurately on the scales, demonstrating their understanding of fractions and proportions. This game prepared students not only for advanced theoretical mathematics, but also for practical applications in commerce, architecture, and even early forms of pharmacy, where precise measurements were paramount. The Liber de Ponderibus, an anonymous Latin text from the 13th century on weights and measures, makes several allusions to playful exercises involving scales for young apprentices, suggesting the widespread nature of such practical learning tools. Some versions of the game included a series of riddle-like cards, each describing a scenario requiring a specific measurement or calculation, such as a merchant has 4 barrels of wine, each weighing 200 pounds, but only 1 barrel is full. How much does the empty barrel weigh? This encouraged critical thinking and problem-solving. A notable set of such scales, reportedly used by the apprentices of Master Gerard of Cremona, a renowned translator in the 12th century, survives in fragments, demonstrating the game's tangible nature and its role in fostering precision. Apprentices would often compete to see who could achieve the target weight with the fewest adjustments, thus honing their estimation skills and their understanding of material densities. This competitive element added a layer of excitement to what might otherwise seem a purely academic pursuit. Number 6. The Chant of the Guilds. Imagine a group of apprentices perhaps huddled in the bustling common room of a guild house, or gathered in the chill of a monastic dormitory, engaged in a rhythmic call and response game. This was the Chant of the Guilds, a mnemonic game designed to instill vast amounts of vocational knowledge and specific trade regulations into young minds during the 13th to 15th centuries. Unlike modern quizzes, this was an oral tradition passed down through generations of apprentices and masters. The game involved reciting long sequences of rules, terms, and procedures associated with a specific craft, often set to a simple, repetitive melody or a spoken rhythm, making it easier to remember. One player, often the master or an older apprentice, would initiate a chant by stating a premise or the beginning of a rule. For instance, for a master baker, the grain must be. The next player would have to complete the phrase accurately, perhaps, inspected for weevils and ground to a fine flour. If correct, they would then add the next line or rule. If incorrect, or if they hesitated too long, they might be required to perform a small humorous task, like fetching water or sweeping the floor, before the turn passed to another player. The game covered everything from the proper methods of dyeing wool to the specific dimensions for cutting timber beams, from the names of tools to the penalties for infractions against guild regulations. Chants could grow incredibly long and complex, encompassing entire sections of a guild's ordinances, or the complete process for creating a specific product, from raw material to finished good. Typical sequence for a stonemason's apprentice might involve chanting the names of different types of stone, the tools used for each, the steps for dressing a block, and the various jointing techniques. The The repetitive nature of the game, combined with its melodic elements, helped embed this practical knowledge deeply within the memory of the participants. The Book of London Guilds, a collection of guild statutes from the 14th century, mentions that young men do learn the ordinances by rote, often in merry companies, which points to the existence of such playful yet educational activities. Students of rhetoric also adapted this game to memorize long passages of classical or biblical texts, transforming it into a general memory aid. Fragments of these rhyming chants, sometimes written on the blank pages of apprentices' account books, reveal lines like, "The tanner's hide, it must be dried, before in pits it's soaked and tied," showing the practical rhyming nature of the game. These chants served as living textbooks passed from mouth to ear, ensuring that the critical knowledge of a trade was thoroughly ingrained in the next generation. The game fostered a strong sense of community within the guild, as older apprentices mentored younger ones, and collective memory was built through shared recitation. Number 5. The Astrolabe's Riddle. Step into the medieval classroom, not for a dry lecture on the cosmos, but for a hands-on exploration of the heavens through a game called the Astrolabe's Riddle. This game, prominent from the 10th century onwards, especially in Islamic schools and later in European centers of learning like Toledo and Oxford, was a sophisticated tool for teaching astronomy, navigation, and practical geometry. It centered around an actual astrolabe, a complex scientific instrument used for measuring altitudes of celestial bodies and for solving astronomical problems. The game transformed its operation into a series of challenges and puzzles, making the learning process interactive and engaging. Players would be presented with a specific astronomical problem or a scenario. For instance, determine the time of sunrise on the vernal equinox in Damascus, or identify the constellation visible at midnight in Canterbury during Advent. Using the astrolabe, students had to manipulate its various parts. The ret, a web-like projection of stars, the plates, showing celestial coordinates for specific latitudes, and the rule and alidade for measuring angles to arrive at the correct answer. Challenges were not just about reading the instrument. They required a deep understanding of celestial mechanics and the principles of trigonometry. A game master, often a skilled astronomer or a knowledgeable monk, would set these riddles. The astrolabe itself was the key. Students would adjust the rete to match the date, align the alidade with a hypothetical star's position, and then read off the time or altitude from the engraved scales. Success meant accurately reading the astrolabe and articulating the astronomical principle behind the solution. Failure meant reviewing the concepts or attempting a simpler riddle. Some advanced versions of the game involve calculating planetary positions for predicting lunar phases, pushing the student's understanding to its limits. Treatise on the Astrolabe by Geoffrey Chaucer, written in the late 14th century for his son Lewis, describes various practical applications of the instrument, many of which could easily be adapted into such a game, highlighting its educational utility for the time. Surviving medieval astrolabes often show wear patterns consistent with frequent handling and adjustment, indicating their use as practical learning tools, not just static display items. Students would often draw their own simplified astrolabes on parchment, filling in the constellations and latitude lines as a way to internalize the complex workings of the instrument. The game fostered not only a grasp of celestial mechanics, but also developed fine motor skills and precision in reading instruments, skills valuable for navigation and calendrical calculations. The competitive aspect involved seeing who could solve a riddle most quickly or accurately, adding a dynamic edge to the study of the stars. Number 4. The Chronicler's Scroll. Imagine a group of young scholars, maybe future scribes or clerks, gathered around a long piece of parchment or a series of interconnected wax tablets, each adding to a developing narrative. This was the Chronicler's Scroll, a sophisticated game of historical recall, narrative construction, and verifiable facts, popular in monastic schools and noble households from the 13th to 15th centuries. It was a group storytelling exercise, but with strict rules. Every edition had to be historically accurate, logically consistent, and presented with a certain elegance of language. The game aimed to train students in historical knowledge, narrative coherence, and the art of eloquent recitation. A game master would start by declaring a historical period or a significant event. For example, the Norman conquest of England or the reign of King Charlemagne. One student would then begin recounting events from that period, stating a fact or describing an incident. For instance, in the year 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, claimed the throne of England. The next student would then have to add another historically accurate and chronologically sensible detail, building upon the previous statement, and prepared a great invasion fleet at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme. If a student introduced anachronism, a factual error, or a logical inconsistency, they were challenged by the other players or the game master. An error meant losing a turn or having to consult a historical text on the spot to correct their mistake. The game continued until a significant historical event was concluded or a predetermined length of the scroll was filled. Collective narrative, once complete, often represented a detailed timeline of events. This was not just about memorizing dates. It was about understanding cause and effect, the relationships between events, and the significance of historical figures. A letter from a teacher at Notre Dame School in the late 13th century describes a chronicle game where students do build histories from the ground up with only true bricks of fact, emphasizing its rigorous nature. Some scrolls were literally written on long pieces of parchment, with students adding their contributions in different colored inks or in sections. Practice of commonplace books, where students copied and organized historical facts and anecdotes often found in medieval libraries, suggests a systematic approach to historical memory that this game would have reinforced. The game also encouraged students to develop strong oral presentation skills, as each contribution had to be clear, articulate, and often delivered with appropriate gravity. This public performance aspect ensured that students not only knew the facts, but could also convey them effectively, a vital skill for future administrators and scholars. The competitive element often involved judging the elegance of the language used or the depth of detail provided, pushing students to excel in both knowledge and expression. Number 3. The monk's illuminated manuscript. Imagine a silent, intense session in a monastic scriptorium, but instead of laborious copying, students are engaged in a delicate, creative, and highly educational competition. This was the monk's illuminated manuscript, a collaborative and competitive game popular among aspiring scribes, illuminators, and even young novices from the 10th to 15th centuries. The game focused on precision, artistic skill, knowledge of symbolism, and meticulous attention to detail, all crucial for the creation of beautiful and accurate books. It was a tangible way to learn the craft of manuscript production, far beyond merely watching a master at work. The game began with a blank piece of parchment, sometimes already pre-ruled, and a selection of quills, inks, and pigments prepared in the scriptorium. A game master, usually an experienced illuminator or scribe, would set a specific task. This might involve copying a short passage of Latin text in a particular script style, such as Carolingian minuscule or Gothic textura, or perhaps decorating a specific initial letter with appropriate flourishes and symbolic imagery. The challenge was to execute the task with the utmost accuracy and beauty, replicating the style and standards of the master. One common variation involved a relay format, where one student would begin by copying a line of text, the next would add an initial, and a third would perhaps paint a small miniature or a border design. Each contribution had to batting blend with the others, requiring precise communication and an understanding of the overall aesthetic. If a line of text was crooked, an initial poorly formed, or a pigment mixed incorrectly, the student would be asked to redo it, or the manuscript would be considered flawed. The game fostered patience, fine motor skills, and an intimate understanding of the materials and techniques involved in bookmaking. Treatise on the Art of Illumination, a 12th century text often attributed to Theophilus Presbyter, describes various techniques of preparing pigments and applying gold leaf, knowledge that would have been essential for participating in such a game. Surviving practice sheets from medieval scriptoria, often containing repeated attempts at specific letters or decorative patterns, provide a tangible link to this form of learning. These sheets, sometimes found bound with more formal texts, show the iterative process of skill development. The game also introduced students to the rich world of medieval symbolism, as they learned which animals, plants, or colors were appropriate for different religious or secular contexts. For example, a student might be asked to illuminate an initial A with a symbol of divinity, requiring knowledge of specific iconography. The competitive elements often involve the master judging the finished pieces for their adherence to form, color accuracy, and overall aesthetic appeal, making it a valuable assessment tool for the student's progress. Number 2. The serf's calendar wheel. Imagine a large circular disc, often made of wood or thick parchment, divided into 12 segments representing the months. Within each segment, smaller illustrations or symbols depicted agricultural tasks, changing weather patterns, or important saints' days. This was the serf's calendar wheel, a practical and highly interactive educational game for young people, especially in rural communities and manorial estates from the 9th to 14th centuries. It wasn't just for serfs, it was a fundamental tool for understanding the rhythms of agrarian life, crucial for anyone dependent on the land. The game taught agricultural knowledge, timekeeping, and natural cycles. The game masters, often village elders, experienced peasants, or manorial stewards, would spin the central part of the wheel, which might contain a pointer or a window revealing a specific month. Challenge was then for the players to accurately describe the typical activities for that month. For instance, if the pointer landed on February, a player might have to describe, in February, the ground begins to thaw, and farmers prepare their tools for plowing. We also celebrate the Feast of St. Bridget, where the first lambs are often born. If they failed to mention a key activity or a significant saint's day, they might have to perform a small, non-punitive task, like mimicking the sound of a sheep or demonstrating a plowing motion. The wheel might also include symbols for weather patterns, and players would have to associate these with the correct month and explain their significance for crops or livestock. Some versions incorporated riddles related to the agricultural year, such as, "What is it that sleeps through winter and awakens to feed a village?" The stored grain. The game was often played outdoors or in community barns, linking the abstract knowledge of the calendar to the tangible reality of the agricultural landscape. The Tachinum Sanitabus, a medieval handbook on health and well-being from the 14th century, illustrates various seasonal activities that would have been central to this game, highlighting the importance of understanding the yearly cycle. Fragmentary remains of such calendar wheels have been unearthed in archaeological digs at medieval village sites, suggesting their common use as practical educational aids. This game fostered a deep, intuitive understanding of the interconnectedness of nature, labor, and sustenance, essential for survival in a primarily agricultural society. It also instilled respect for the passage of time and the importance of planning for the seasons. Communal aspect of the game, with multiple generations participating, ensured that traditional knowledge was effectively transferred from elders to the young, building a shared understanding of the land's bounty and its demands. Number 1. The Bard's Battle of Wits. Step into the lively hall of a castle or a bustling tavern where fires glow and voices rise in spirited competition. This was the Bard's Battle of Wits, an exhilarating game of improvised poetry, rhetoric, and verbal agility, popular among courtly entertainers, wandering minstrels, and even university students from the 12th to 15th centuries. It was not merely about entertainment. It was a rigorous training ground for language skills, persuasive argumentation, and quick thinking, vital for anyone who sought to influence, entertain, or educate through spoken word. The game involved 2 or more participants, or bards, who would take turns improvising verses on a given theme or responding to an opponent's challenge in poetic form. The theme might be a historical event, a moral dilemma, a celebration of a lord, or a critique of a vice. One bard would begin with a short verse, often setting the meter and rhyme scheme. For example, "The knight, so brave with shining blade, through forest dark his journey made." The next bard would have to continue the story or argument, maintaining the poetic structure, adding new information, or cleverly refuting a previous point. For example, "But danger lurked, a wicked sprite, who sought to dim his valiant light. The battle came from the verbal sparring." Bards would try to outwit each other with clever rhymes, unexpected twists, sophisticated vocabulary, and rhetorical devices. They might incorporate elements of satire, flattery, or logical argument, all within the strictures of poetic form. A challenge could be issued directly, such as, "Can you praise the virtue of humility in 3 lines without once mentioning a monk?" Failure to maintain the rhythm, rhyme, or theme, or a long pause meant losing the round. The audience, often including nobility, scholars, and common folk, would act as judges, their applause and murmurs indicating who delivered the more impressive verses. Chronica Majora by Matthew Paris, a 13th century English Benedictine monk, contains accounts of minstrels performing witty exchanges in rhymed Latin, which suggests the formal and educational application of such verbal contests. These battles were not just for entertainment. They honed skills in elocution, composition, and logical structure, making them valuable exercises for anyone involved in law, theology, or public speaking. Collections of medieval riddles and poetic challenges, sometimes found in marginalia of student textbooks, suggest that such games were used as a means of improving linguistic dexterity and critical thinking. The game also required a vast vocabulary and a quick mind, as bards had to access their knowledge and weave it into verse on the fly. It was a test of both memory and spontaneous creativity, pushing students to think on their feet and articulate complex ideas with eloquence and wit. The most successful bards often found patronage, highlighting the practical value of excelling in this demanding yet entertaining form of education.